archaeological and anthropological period, the pre-dynastic period, the dynastic period, because unfortunately people forget that many African civilizations had dynastic period besides Egypt or other nations along the Nile. I would also break that up to Africa before the coming of alien peoples. And then I will go on to that, Africa up to the beginning of the encroachment as to the colonial period. And then I will go on to Africa in the current period. Now you could break up African history into various forms depending on what you plan to do.
All right, well, let's move swiftly in the limited time that we have. Let's start with the archaeological period.
The archaeological period will be that period in which you're talking about the artifacts and fossils. The artifacts, like the stone equipment, stone implements and so forth, and the fossil period being the human finds. And that will bring us back to the Zinjanthropus period, all the way up to what we would today call man as we know him using agriculture and so forth. And
how far back in time are we talking about now?
Based upon the latest findings, we're talking about at least 3 million and a fraction into 4 million with a fossil called Lucy. And then we're talking to a much later fossil by the name of Zinjanthropus boise. And that will bring us down to about 1.7 million to 2 million years ago.
Is there any question about the fact that the first human life occurred in Africa? Is that incontestable?
To date, the oldest human find has been in Africa, to date. Now, what will happen tomorrow may be something else.
All right. Let's move forward.
Now, with man coming out of this period, we see him going down the Nile, and the reason we're using the Nile as the example in that the oldest records of human behavior, where the man left his record, has been found in that specific area.
Why is that?
Well, for many reasons, but the most specific, man along the Nile built in stone. He built in masonry material, and therefore that material outlasts men who were building in wood or other such perishable material. And that's primarily the basic reason.
So it's not that in that part of the world of Africa that there was a greater expertise or technology or anything like that?
Based upon anthropological and archaeological finding, there have been very old period. For example, in Southern Africa, in Swaziland, there is a 43,000-year-old iron mine found there. So that would indicate we're talking about 43,000 years, meaning that since we're dealing with historical record, it matches most of the things that we find along the line, and most specifically in Egypt, where we go back to the Sibyllian period. The Sibyllian, the first and second period in Egypt will be about 125,000 BC. Back to 300,000 BC. The second period would be 125,000 to 25,000. So in between here, that mine was being used, meaning then that the Africans in the southernmost tip of Africa, otherwise then called Monomotapa, the earliest name when the Europeans came, it was called that, were involved and engaged in iron mining at a time when it wasn't so done in Egypt, because the civilization or high cultures traveled down to Egypt from the central part of Africa, and every archaeological evidence show that it equally traveled down from the central part of Africa to the other tip, the southern tip. So the civilization seemed to have started around the major lakes.
Why do the features of the Egyptian, as we see on the stones and whatnot, seem to differ so much from our classic impression of African features?
Well, because what has happened is that most of the Egyptians you see in textbooks are the Egyptian pharaohs at the time when Asians or Africans had invaded Egypt, and their people stood on the throne. So that when we say the word pharaoh, a pharaoh could have been one who had come from Asia, like the case of the Hyksos, or from Persia or something like that in the case of the Persian. Or later, it could have been one of the conquerors who had come from Greece or from Rome. Now, the ancient African pharaohs, they seldom show you, if ever, and more so, there is a myth that all Africans have thick lips like myself or heavy nose. There are tremendous amount, millions upon millions of Africans who have pointed features. So that the image of a pharaoh with what is called a Western type or pointed or aquiline nose doesn't mean that that person wasn't an African equally. So,
and many of the likenesses of those with African features were destroyed by European invaders?
European and Asian invaders, but more specifically European invaders. Or when the nose didn't look the way that they thought it should look, the nose suddenly got broken. It's strange that the Romans and the Greeks, who had more pointed nose, when you go to Alexandria in that part of the museum, not a single nose is broken. But when you get to the indigenous African, almost to the last one, the nose got damaged when that nose should not have gotten damaged on the basis of the length of the nose.
What about the structure in the early formings of civilization in Africa? What was a family structure like?
Well, in African families, you could say this would be typical. There's some things about the continent of Africa you can't say is typical by virtue of the size and the variations of cultures and so forth. But there are other things you could say were typical. One of the typical things with Africa was the predominance of family value. And you would say that the matriarch society, the society in which one inherits from one mother, was more dominant than the patrilineal society. That doesn't mean, however, that the women ran the society, but that the source of the society, the source of the family, was of the woman. That, for example, the ancient Egyptians made it very clear that for the pharaoh to inherit legally the throne, he had to get it through a woman. Many a times pharaohs would then marry their daughter. Doesn't mean that they had sex relation with their daughter, but they had that legal entanglement which was necessary. In West Africa, we saw the same thing.
Was the woman's name passed on in marriage, or unlike what we know, the man's name has to predominate?
Well, you didn't, because then since you didn't have family names. You know, this thing about, it started in Germany with, most of the early cultures didn't have family names. The Germans are one of the first to invent this family name business. In West Africa, you see the same thing. The Ashantis, the king inherited his title from the queen mother.
I see.
You see here, you got it from one end of the continent to the other end of the continent, showing the commonality of culture. Then there was a second thing that involved there, is the interrelationship of family, clan, and village. That the individual, there was no African individual as such. Like we would say in the States, I'm an individual, I'm doing my thing. You couldn't be that type of individual. And that put me to the mind of saying something classical here, is that the myth that prostitution started from the first man and the first woman. I don't know which first man and first woman they're talking about. It's obviously not Africans. Because the African society made it so that there couldn't even be a single woman. You couldn't have a single woman living by herself. All people were attached to family. If a woman became widowed, she either went back to her own family or to her husband's family. You were always attached to someone. Therefore, most of African society started in a communal basis. One was related to one's family, immediate family, then to the clan, then to the village, then to the state. So that each individual had